Hi everybody, I'm Adam Booth.
And I'm Dakota Karper.
And we're going to share this story together. This is a story that comes from Western Maryland, and it was recorded a long time ago on paper. And tracing back what's said in that story, it seems that this story took place in the late 19th century. And back in those days, in that part of Western Maryland and West Virginia that kind of crouches up against it, it'd be easy to find a pretty regular square dance in all the little towns that dotted the landscape there. And there was a young woman by the name of Lizzie Lloyd, and she was the belle of all those square dances. She got invited to every single one of them, and she was the kind of dancer that never knew that there were chairs at a square dance, because she never sat down. Lizzie Lloyd was a beautiful young woman, charming. She had hair that smelled like apple blossoms without even using any of that fancy milled soap. She had eyes that somehow caught the light and twinkled no matter when she was turning or spinning during the dance. And a dance was coming up. It was time for the next dance. And this young man by the name of Artie jumped right up and asked her to dance with him, and she knew that he was not a good dancer. But she didn't want to hurt his feelings, so she said, "Oh, all right, Artie, I'll dance with you this one dance." And before she could change her mind, well, the square dance caller jumped up on a bale of straw, said, "All right, everybody get your partner, square up your sets, and take it away, band." Well, take your neighbor by the hand, everybody turn with a right and left grand. And find your lady all alone, turn her by the hand and promenade home. Well, poor Artie, like I said, he wasn't a very good dancer, and with that first call being a right and left grand, he just messed it right up. Which meant that Lizzie ended up in the arms of someone else. She ended up in the arms of Hank Morgan. Oh, Hank Morgan. Tall, handsome young man, thin with strong hands and deep dimples. He's the kind of fella that all the young ladies had been keeping their eyes on since he walked through the door that night. And here Lizzie was, in his arms. And you know, there was something about the way that he draped his arm over her shoulder in that promenade, and something about the way she leaned into his side that let both of them know that this was not going to be their last dance together. Well, the courting continued. Hank kept courting Lizzie for some time after that. And during that time, she found out that not only was he a great dancer, but he also had a fine hand on the fiddle. He was actually a third-generation fiddler. He knew all the old tunes, like the Arkansas Traveler, the Cumberland Gap, the Salt Sack Behind the Door. But he had a good ear for coming up with new tunes also. And he found in Lizzie all kinds of inspiration. He'd come up with a new tune and take her out and play that tune for her down by the water. Come up with another one and do just the same. But there was one tune that he started creating, and as soon as he pulled the bow across the strings the very first time, he knew there was something extra special about this tune. And so he took a very long time crafting it just right. And he saved it for a special day. And on that day, he took Lizzie down for a long walk by the creek till they got to an outcropping of rocks, and he sat her down on the rocks and sat right next to her. And he looked in those twinkling eyes and said, "Now, Lizzie Lloyd, there's something I've been wanting to ask you for quite some time now. But before I do, I got a special present for you. A fiddle tune. A tune that I've been taking a long time to come up with. A tune that is just for you and nobody else. If you listen close, I think you'll hear a little bit of me and a little bit of you in it. And he lifted that fiddle up into his arm and placed the bow on the string. As he played, it seemed to Lizzie as if all the sadness in the whole world came out of that fiddle. And at the same time, all the hope in the whole world. And she thought, boy, if there is a man that understands hope and sadness like that, well, I could spend the rest of my life getting to know that man. She looked through a gloss of tears covering her eyes and she said, Hank Morgan, that has got to be the most beautiful music my ears have ever heard. And to think, it's just for me. Just for me. Well, I take a vow that since that tune is just for me, it can only ever be played for me from here forward. And I curse any fiddle that tries to play that tune for another woman. Now, what was it you were wanting to ask me? It was not long after that Hank and Lizzie were married. And folks said that in marriage they were just as in love as during their courting time. Some folks said even more in love. And you know what often happens next for two people that are that in love? Children. In the blink of an eye, they had children. In a blink of another eye, their children were having children. Blink again, and Lizzie was sick. She wasn't that old, just about 60, but the sickness came on fast, and they could tell that she wasn't long for this world. And so 3 generations of the family gathered together by her bedside. Right next to her was Hank, holding on to her hand. And in that moment, he was a little vulnerable, and he began to share stories that he had guarded close to his heart his whole life. He told his children and grandchildren the story about how Mommy and Daddy, about how Granddaddy and Grandmommy had met each other to square dance, and how he courted her, and how he'd come up with that one special tune that was just for her. And in the telling, he reached over and picked up his fiddle off the peg from the wall and got prepared to play, and just before he did, Lizzie's eyes lit up one last time. She looked across the bed and she said, now Hank, only play it once through, and don't never play it again. Well, it wasn't long after that they laid Lizzie's body in the coffin and lowered it into the ground. And they said that Hank's heart broke so hard and fast that it wasn't long after that he joined her down there. And then things happen. This is where the story gets a little queer. I mentioned that they had children, and one of their children was named Hank Jr. And Hank Jr., he was a widower. And he had a little boy, just about 4 years old, that he was raising all on his own. And he started looking for someone to help raise his little boy with him. Now, Hank Jr. was also a fiddler, pretty good, not as good as Hank Sr., but he was pretty good. And he started thinking, well, if Daddy courted Mommy with that special tune, maybe I could court someone with that same tune. And he knew about the Berkeley widow that lived just across the river, so he started courting her. He took her one day for a long walk, and they took a little rest in the shade of a big old oak tree. And while they were resting there, he picked up his fiddle and tried to play that tune for her. But as soon as the bow touched the strings, it was awful. It sounded like a sawmill. And Hank Jr., oh, he got mad. He got madder than a hornet's nest kicked at both ends. Something must be wrong with his fiddle, he thought. So later that week, he showed it to one of his buddies, and that buddy played around with it, tuned it up, and got it back in working order. So Hank Jr. tried again the next week. He took the Berkeley widow for another long walk down by the water. And when the time was right, he lifted his fiddle up and tried to play that tune again. But the strings just broke right off. His face grew red and shone like the bloodiest of blood moons. Well, I probably don't have to tell you that there wasn't any more courting after that. But it wasn't even a year after that the family had gotten together for a reunion. And Hank Jr. had a son named Hank III, who they called Trip. And at this time, he was maybe about 5 years old. And they were all together in that gathering, and out of nowhere, Trip just sat up straight like the face of Seneca Rocks. And he spoke out as clear as could be to the whole family. I can play Grandmommy's fiddle tune. Now, it was expected that one day he would carry on the family tradition of fiddling, but to that point, he'd never even held a bow in his hands. So they just laughed it off. But that night, after everybody had turned in, music started wafting through the open windows. Music that was all at once sad and hopeful. And as Hank Jr. heard that music in his bed, he thought, well, I forgot, but today is the anniversary of Mommy's death. I wonder if that's Daddy's ghost come back to play the tune for her. So he got up, and the whole family got up, and they followed that music outside, followed it across their property, till they came to that little graveyard at the edge. And imagine the surprise to see that it wasn't Daddy's ghost. No, it was Trip. Little Trip was standing there with a fiddle in his arm, bow in his hand, playing that cursed fiddle tune as he stood right next to his grandmommy's grave. Well, the fiddling was in his blood, and he picked that fiddle up and played for the very first time that tune. And you might wonder how it happened. But remember, it wasn't that nobody could ever play the tune again. It's just that it always had to be played for her.